Hi, Barbies. Hi, Kens. Let's talk about Greta Gerwig's latest film, Barbie. And you'll have to forgive the pink on my face. This Ken did beach all day long. That was his job. So let's talk a little bit of Barbie. I loved this film and I was very much looking forward to it because Greta Gerwig, as an actress, is someone that I adore, but her directorial features, at least her solo projects, have been nothing short of sublime. Lady Bird and Little Women, respectively, were my favorite films of their years. And I think what's so fascinating about Barbie is that even though we're still early on in her directorial career, this is a little bit of an amalgamation of those two films, right? You think about Lady Bird and its sense of place, Little Women, and how it explores identity and womanhood. This film really does both of those things and quite an astounding way. And it's interesting because coming into the film, I think we all knew that it was going to deconstruct those long lasting stereotypes around perfectionism with Barbie. But the way Gerwig does that here still blew away all expectations, partially because of not just her direction, which I do want to talk about, but this film is really funny. It is a romp. It's not at all subtle in its commentary or aesthetics, but that humor is incessant and quite biting throughout a lot of this film. There's one line from Helen Mirren's narrator toward Margot Robbie near the end of this film. You know, the one that was absolutely impeccable, hysterical, maybe the funniest joke of the movie. There's a musical number that breaks out near the end of this film that adds some great levity. Ryan Gosling's I'm Just Ken had me in stitches. The soundtrack on the whole is really wonderful, but that number in particular, especially with the humor, it's fantastic. Gosling's Ken in general is incredibly absurd, but with great purpose. Depression Barbie, oh my God, might be the funniest thing I've seen all year. That commercial that plays is so good. It is so great. This film takes incredible advantage of its premise, and the banter is often very engrossing. The comedic timing of these performances is just really quite astute. Yet simultaneously, and what makes this film so unique and special is that there is this potent emotional core that is affecting. And while subverting perfectionism is the root of it, I think the film gets deeper and more personal as it examines the burdens women carry and the emotional and perhaps psychological cost of constantly feeling as if you're not good enough. And Margot Robbie is terrific in bringing that out in her performance as the film gets into its ideas on womanhood and the patriarchy. And it really is moving, the impossible dichotomies that the film lays out. And based off the response to this film on social media, and also broadly, when you look at the box office numbers for this film and how strong they are, it's clear that a lot of people are responding to this film and relating with those ideas here. There's been a lot of discussion around America Ferrera's monologue that takes place near the third act, and for good reason. It's incredibly poignant and incredibly cathartic. And I think it's enthralling to see how the film takes those patriarchal tropes and wields them as a tool to destroy stereotypes. It's really fantastic and it's satisfying on its own, but I think even more gripping in the context of Barbie's own emotional turmoil. Because right before this rescue sequence that takes place near the end of the film, there's the aforementioned Depression Barbie sequence, a moment that ends in heartbreaking fashion when Barbie reveals that she doesn't feel good enough for anything. And Robbie is really fantastic in this film, but that moment especially, she's striking. And she really brings a pathos to the moment because when you're someone who is constantly asked to be two extremes at once, that feeling of inadequacy is the only outcome. And Barbie's unraveling there, I think, is quite powerful, especially because her exhaustions aren't just rooted in physical standards with being perfect, stereotypical Barbie, but it also, the film equally and cogently depicts the matriarchy with President Barbie and Nobel Prize Barbie and CEO Barbie, all things that we want women to strive for and to be. But many people simply aren't able to achieve those things. And when the expectations are that high, when you don't achieve being president or being CEO, it's maybe easy to feel as if you're not good enough. So the matriarchy of Barbie Land in this film isn't some sort of utopia. It's something that Gerwig wanted to deconstruct as well, because it's not just the beauty and physical standards of Barbie that's arduous to follow. It's the high end status of most Barbies that are also difficult to replicate, thus suggesting that your identity isn't defined by how you look or what job you have. The writing and all of that, the screenplay, it truly is brilliant. And I think Gerwig does such a great job of tapping into, again, why so many people relate to that with those dichotomies. And again, it's not necessarily because of the matriarchy itself, but it's the patriarchy that's driving a lot of those standards as well, which brings us to Ken in this film. And Ken is such a great character. And again, there's a fascinating dichotomy here, right? Because yes, the film does expose the patriarchy and the hollow and impractical expectations of societal machismo, because Ken comes from the world of Barbie where he is secondary to Barbie. It's Barbie and Ken, and his validation comes directly from Barbie, who clearly isn't as interested in him as he is in her. So when he gets to the quote unquote real world, and it's antithetical to what he knows, where people ask him for the time and he's respected in a male dominated society, which the not so subtle commentary and all of that I do find very funny in execution. But as a result, he begins to see masculinity in a much more rudimentary way. And I find it mesmerizing how the film deconstructs male bravado by paralleling it to Barbie, and how worshiping and enforcing certain standards is actually harmful and vapid, which is fascinating because simultaneously it is the real world where Ken's male identity actually prospers and his identity is able to roam free like a wild horse, one could say. So something is unlocked there for Ken, and it's ultimately why I don't think the film is demonizing masculinity. I know there's been a lot of debate about this, but that duality I do think is important, and why ultimately the film is not demonizing masculinity as much as it's suggesting that the superficialities of the patriarchy are anything but fulfilling, and it fails to give him self-worth. There's, of course, a lot of fun to be had there with it in terms of the film's rompness, especially given Gosling's wonderfully outlandish performance. But those ideas, I do think, are very clever and well written. And it also comes down to Gosling's performance, because there are moments before he gets to the real world where we sense his loneliness, or we sense how strong that bond is from his perspective to Barbie. There's a moment where Ken asks Barbie if he can stay the night, and she says, well, it's girls' night once again. And Greta Gerwig does such a great job of letting the camera linger on Ken for a good beat for us to realize that sense of loneliness, and why when he gets to the real world, he responds as strongly as he does, because his identity is wholly tethered to Barbie. And there's a whole arc in this film where he has to realize that he's not tethered to her. He's not tethered to the patriarchy or some sort of farcical idea of masculinity. And of course, there's a shirt that people have been talking about that he wears at the end of this film that I think ultimately nails where the film is trying to go with all of that. Again, the gender dynamics of this film, I do think, are tackled with incredible credence as it, talks about identity and power. So much of this film is arguing that enforcing unrealistic standards on both sides is harmful, whether it be beauty for women or machismo for men, whatever it may be, there are emotional and psychological costs, especially when coupled for any sort of thirst for power, which we see with the Kens inside the matriarchy and how their identities, as I just noted, are tethered to Barbie and how that leaves them lost when Barbie isn't around all of the time. And on the other side of that coin, the patriarchy leads to women being nothing but objects for the Kens to play their guitars at. A scene that is really funny and blistering in this film, which is to say, there are no biases here as it relates to masculinity or femininity. And I think the film goes out of its way to demonstrate how gender can be a tool for self discovery, but also how it's an obstruction inside the confines of societal pillars, which is what makes those ending scenes really powerful because it suggests that our humanity exists separate from our gender and what really defines us, what really gives us power in our lives. That final montage at the end, I think, demonstrates that so beautifully and so poignantly. It's really fantastic and honestly quite slayed me emotionally. I thought it was really, really great. So when it comes to the writing of this film, its themes, it's interesting, right? Because on the surface, and I don't want it to be lost, but yes, this film is really funny. There's a farcical nature to a lot of what plays out here from an action standpoint, from an A to Z standpoint. But underneath are these really nuanced and human ideas as it relates to gender and identity and the patriarchy and the matriarchy and where we all stand inside all of that. And why, at the end of the day, we just want to be human. It's not about necessarily these extremes of masculinity or femininity, but just this thirst for humanity. And there's nuance there that I think Gerwig taps into so wonderfully here. And then there's her direction. And man, the practicality of the set designs, the coloration, all of the pinkness of this film. It's fantastic. There's a lot of old school filmmaking here, coupled with some modern CGI that is really wonderful. And as an aesthetic experience, everything here is so immersive and wonderfully bombastic. It's visually appealing in every way, but maybe more impressively, it's how Gerwig manages tone because it is over the top at times, but also there's this blistering emotion that comes about. And I think she threads that needle perfectly, sometimes in the same moment. I talked about the narration of Helen Mirren. Well, that comes at the film's emotional peak. And yet we throw in a little joke there that is fantastic. And that's one example, but there's many. It's that clashing of tone, which in the hands of other filmmakers probably wouldn't work. But Gerwig does such a great job of managing that tone. It's really quite brilliant. So yeah, there's so much to love about this film. The performance about Ryan Gosling, Margot Robbie, and they are, in fact, I thought a little bit of Amy Adams in Arrival, weirdly, because that film has nothing to do with Barbie in any way, shape, or form. But that performance by Amy Adams is tricky because she's having to do two things simultaneously and make it all very seamless. And that's what Margot Robbie and Ryan Gosling are having to do here as well, as being toys. And so there's a sense of fakery to them, but also, especially with Margot Robbie, but even with Ken as well, there is more to these desires that they carry, that they want, and how they're able to tap into that sincerity, but also the buffoonery of this film is just really great. But the supporting cast across the board is also really great. So yeah, I really do love these performances. It truly is one of the best films of the year. Cannot say enough good things about Greta Gerwig. This is another big win for her, and I cannot wait to see what she does next. We do have a full written review of this up at InSessionFilm.com. We have a podcast review of this as well that you can check out here on YouTube or on your podcast app of choice, where we go much deeper and even further into this film than what I did just here. And I'm sure we'll have more to say about this film as we go, because this is going to be a film that's going to be talked about for weeks to come, maybe months, and certainly when we get to the year-end wrap-up and award stuff, I'm fairly certain Barbie will be a part of that conversation in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, it's really great. If you haven't seen it, and you probably have, but if you haven't, go see it, or go see it again. It's great. Greta Gerwig at her best here.